Ileana stood outside the cabin as she gazed at Magnus, who sat inside reading a book. Because she'd given him books and the antidote, she'd expected that he would be leaving on his own very soon. Or at the very least in 2 months' time. Until then it would be best not to see each other. If the female lead and Magnus were truly destined to be together, they would meet during his escape. She would leave everything else up to fate. She told the coachman to take her to the temple. She walked up the steps toward the priest. He sat in front of the altar that held a donation box. She wanted to know if there was a devotional congregation, a place where she could practice her belief in God amongst like-minded people, but the priest told her there was no such thing. However, there was training she could undergo to become a priest. They were taught about God's will, although it was conditional to stay in the dorms while being taught. This piqued Ileana's interest. How long does these teachings last? She'd wanted to know. She needed to stay at the temple for at least 2 years. That would be enough time for the story to progress the way it was supposed to without her running into Magnus. She liked to join, she told him, and the priest looked at her solemnly. Do you really want to become a priest? She wanted to be as close to God as possible, she answered. He stared at her with the same solemn expression which made her nervous. But then he smiled and gave the application form. She would need to sign it and hand it in by today. They would be leaving in the next 2 weeks, so she had to prepare for the trip. 2 weeks from now? The next application period would be in 2 years, but she couldn't wait until then. Ileana stood quiet as she worried about leaving Magnus so abruptly. But he'd be all right, because Carl would be there to take care of him, and his brainwashing had begun to wear off. She told him she'd be back in 2 weeks, ready to leave. She entered the mansion to find the servants frantically scurrying about. What had happened? The maid told her the Marquis had to leave for the estate because there was a reported emergency. She let out a relieved sigh when she heard that. The fear of meeting her father drained out of her. She headed for her room. She would not be having dinner, so she was not to be disturbed. She needed to get as much information as possible before she left in 2 weeks, but she grew frustrated when she couldn't find even a single diary. She searched the drawer hoping for a secret compartment, and as luck would have it, she found a button. It revealed a notebook that was hidden away. She read through it, confused at first. Was this Ileana's diary? But what were these sequence of dates? Confusion turned into a mass of chaos in her mind as she read, Imperial Calendar 931, November 13th, the beast ran away. No way, what was this? Why was an event that hadn't yet happened, already written down in Ileana's diary? Ileana stood, bewildered. The diary should have only been written until Imperial Year 930. But as she read on, the diary listed and described events that were supposed to happen in the future. But what shook her the most was that Ileana had written down an exact date to let Magnus go. She let him go on purpose. Now that she thought about it, it was strange from the beginning. In the story, she always carried the antidote on her person at all times. And she'd even revealed that bit of information to Magnus. When Held eventually stolen the antidote, she'd acted as if she'd been waiting for that moment. Had she really not foreseen Magnus' escape in the story? From taming him down to his revenge against her, it was almost as if she had planned every detail. Did she have the power of foresight? The diary was clearly written from her perspective. Was this the diary she'd hidden during her exile? Ileana struggled to make sense of it all. Could it be someone had maybe given her this diary? She tugged on her hair, a frustrated furrow to her brows. Only the author could have done this. Why did they claim not to know? Did they want Ileana to find the answer to that question? Would she only be able to return to her world if she does? But how? She tried to make sense of what was written, but she couldn't. Ileana seemed to have planned everything, but why? To give Magnus the throne? Was it because she loved him? The novel didn't end with Ileana's death. Once Magnus found out who Miss Lina was, he slaughtered every one of the Glane family before Ileana's very eyes, and then he locked her up for the rest of her days. where no one would see her. Was love really worth such suffering and pain? She covered her ears and hunched over. What was this empty feeling? She looked up, empty eyes reflecting what she felt inside. She was exhausted. Back at the lodge, the guards frantically fed Mag the antidote as he went into a series of seizures. He opened his eyes, dazed and unclear. Where was Miss Lina? Why didn't she stay by his side? He remembered her words. If he wasn't her beast, what could he be of hers? He was a human, she'd told him. She, who was now gentle as she hadn't been before. But why couldn't he go outside? Why couldn't he leave? He thought as he watched the guards close the door and the room plummeted into darkness. No, he hated the dark. Soon those nightmares would plague him once again. He begged softly for help, but no one came. Someone tapped him on the shoulder. Was it Lady Lina? But no, there were two men. We're going hunting in that forest today, Mutt, the man said mockingly. He was in a forest. He knew them. Big brother? Little Magnus questioned. We'll acknowledge you if you hunt great prey, they told him as they walked ahead. Magnus got up and followed. They continued to mock him as they called him stupid and compared him to prey. Magnus nervously told them they shouldn't kill animals for fun and they looked at him in disdain. Perhaps he no longer wants to be a brother to us, his brother said. They knew how much he longed for their acknowledgement, and they wielded it like a weapon. He stuttered out a denial. His brother pulled out a basket of sandwiches the maids had prepared for Magnus. He took a sandwich and dropped it to the ground all the while, mocking Magnus for being weak. He stepped on it, and they laughed. Follow us, they said. He meekly said yes, and followed. He so desperately wanted to be one of them. To be able to laugh and do brotherly things. But how did he end up in this situation? What are you doing? He asked fearful as his brother pushed him further and further towards the edge of the cliff, taunting him with a sharp sword pointed at Magnus' neck. He pushed Magnus and he fell. The last thing he saw was his brother's arrogant smile. He gasped as he woke up from his nightmare. Sweat covered his skin. He clutched the arm near his face like a lifeline. It's okay. It's just a dream, Ileana told him as he violently shivered. After he'd calmed down, she'd left to talk with Carl outside. He told her about Magnus' seizures, but he'd be all right. He was no longer required to take any of the antidote, although Magnus would still experience some withdrawal symptoms, but that was normal. Carl was not needed to visit this place anymore, and she warned him once again to keep quiet about everything he'd seen here. He assured her that he wouldn't tell a soul. She entered the cabin and found Mag awake. He felt much better now, although he seemed to have sweated profusely, she pointed out as she caressed his cheek. He smiled, but his expression was downcast. It had been a while since she came here. But she only answered vaguely about how busy she'd been. Her words seemed to sadden him, but she noticed the changes in him since she last saw him. His skin had taken on a healthy hue, and he must have grown a few inches too. The smell of Ray was not so pungent anymore too. She picked up a book from the counter as she asked him about the books he read. His eyes turned devilish, and he told her he found out some interesting things within the pages of those books. If he was a human, then unlike a pet, he could tell her who he liked. He grabbed her shoulder as he told her, humans aren't always together, but a pet and its owner were usually together until their very last breath. Oh, how he'd very much like to stay by Miss Lina's side as her pet, he said softly, contentment in his voice. She thought back to her conversation with Carl. She'd once asked him how to go about undoing the brainwashing of a person. He'd explained that in some cases that person is either too weak to break the shackles of the brainwashing or new orders were periodically given to overwrite the effects of the previous conditioning. In the end, both the original Ileana and herself had resorted to conditioning Magnus to behave the way they'd wanted just to achieve their own goals. But what if Ileana's power was stronger than she expected it to be? He hugged her from behind as he implored softly, "Let me continue to be your beast." He promised to never betray her. Her heart faltered at his words. If he were to become human, he would eventually be separated from her, he explained. Had he ever thought about why he doesn't want to leave her? He smiled shyly. It's because he liked her so much. But what about her did he like? She wanted to know as she turned to look at him with a gentle smile of her own. Obviously, he liked her because... He stopped. A look of confusion crossed his face. He didn't know why. He stuttered out an answer, trying to figure out why. This right here was the result of Ileana's conditioning. If he ever found out the truth after he left there, he wouldn't gift her with such smiles ever again. There was a burning desire within her whenever she was in his presence. Surely this uncontrollable feeling belonged to the original Ileana. She comforted him, stroked his cheek. It was natural to be a human. He just needed to adjust to the feeling. She told him to sit and have some tea. Was she really fine with being separated from him if he became human? He wanted to know. But she just urged him to sit. She stared at him. How unimaginable it was that this man was to become a cruel emperor in the distant future who would brutally kill his own brothers. Why he killed them though, was not revealed in the novel. He blushed as he caught her staring. She needed to put distance between herself and this man lest she get caught up in his tyranny later on. She was to stay with him until nightfall as promised. Curse me if you want. That was clearly written in Ileana's diary. If she hurt him, would that cause him to lose all confidence in Ileana? Would that make him give up on her? She wouldn't spend the night with him if that were the case. She tapped her cup as she told him cruelly that the reason she hadn't been coming by was because she was fed up with him. She didn't need him anymore. His eyes lost its glow as fear overcame him. He mumbled out a question but her words once more shocked him quiet. You mean nothing to me now. He looked down, his bangs hiding his eyes. He sat still and quiet, hands folded in his lap. She got up intending to leave but he grabbed the folds of her skirt and cried, tears running down his ruddy cheeks. Please don't go, he begged. He fell to his knees and looked at her with desperate eyes. She'd promised to stay with him. How cruel did she have to be to him, for him to let her go? Did she have no choice but to give a new command? She pat his head and he calmed down at her touch. But even if she brainwashed him, and then what? She knew how cruel it was to leave him in a week's time. She knew Magnus wasn't prepared for it, but this was for her survival in the end. He wanted a hug. She tried to refuse, but he grabbed her and pulled her into his arms, holding her captive. His eyes, which had taken on a dangerous glint, reflected his desire. Things would have been different if he wasn't a beast. Would she be with him forever if he was a human? She couldn't move. Did she hear him right? Lightning flashed outside, and his words sounded all the more dangerous. It has lingered in my mind, he said. He grabbed her hair in a clenched fist, but she dismissed his words with an uneasy smile. He leaned closer and spoke softly, arrogantly. Did she not recognize it yet? He'd seen her feelings for him, exposed and raw. Especially her eyes. He could clearly see the affection reflecting back at him. She turned and headed for the door. She couldn't let him shake her like this. But he pulled her back. Would she still come back for him? It didn't matter if she'd become tired of him, he said desperately. She opened her mouth, a refusal ready on her lips, but he would hear none of it as he continued to beg, reverting back to the vulnerable, emotional Mag she knew him as. He already knew her answer but pleaded, nonetheless. How it broke her heart to hear him beg her so. She's the one who'd caused him such sorrow. He shouldn't be begging her. She took his hand gently and smiled a sad smile. Please take care, Mag. With those words she rushed out the door. He shouted out her name as he cried. She ran as fast as she could to the carriage, all the while commanding herself not to look back at him. At him who begged and cried in despair. He couldn't go out, she knew. He couldn't leave the cabin because fear trapped him in there. It was his safe place. She crumpled to the ground, her emotions overwhelmed her. It's not her emotions though. It must be lingering emotions of the original Ileana. She tried desperately to convince herself as rain soaked her clothes. But she could feel none of the cold seeping into her skin. She got up after some time. The coachman had brought an umbrella out for her. She had come to a decision. It took Magnus 2 years to become entirely dependent on Ileana, so it would likely take the same amount of time for her to fade from his memory, along with all these chaotic emotions. She wouldn't live under the name Ileana for the next 2 years. Their twisted relationship had finally come to an end. Farewell Magnus, she thought, grief already burrowing its way into her heart. Children ran and sang as she passed them in the streets. Ileana stood and commented on the weather. A lady spoke up behind her. Khotan's weather this time of year was usually like this. She jumped on Ileana's back playfully, which surprised Ileana. She'd had made a friend, although not of her choosing. Her name was Shalia. No matter how hard Ileana tried to keep a distance between them, Shalia would have none of it. She was not fazed by Ileana's cold demeanor. Ileana ran trying to keep up with Shalia. She'd assumed the training for priesthood would have been simple and boring. What she didn't expect was attending classes as if she was studying for Korean entrance exams. From 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. she prayed and studied. If it weren't for Magnus, she would have already fled. She still received attention for being a noble lady studying to become a priest. So much unwanted attention, but she usually ignored them all. After all, she waited here for time to pass. After class, she walked with Shalia, badgering her with many questions but stopped. She'd forgotten something she said and turned, going back. She waved and smiled as Shalia walked ahead. But that was all just an excuse. Shalia had the same color hair as Magnus, so it bothered Ileana a lot. After that fateful day, she still got weekly reports on him. Overall, his addiction was getting better, they'd said. Her heart still ached when she thought about Magnus. When would it get better? She heard a shout. She'd wandered to a side building, so lost in her thoughts. She looked to the back of the building. She saw men in hooded cloaks and a priest. The priest told them that they'd researched the dark characters in myths. Those characters which were none other than the devil's language. Although those characters varied in different places, they all still lead to one definite, the forbidden book of prophecy. A mysterious book that was known to only exist in myths, was in fact real. That very book could foretell the future of this empire. Ileana was confused because the novel never mentioned a book of prophecy. She quickly hid as one man looked her way. The priest asked the hooded man, who seemed to be the leader, for help. They needed to find and destroy it. But the man pulled out his sword and slashed the priest across his chest. It instantly killed him. Ileana, who'd witnessed everything, clutched her hands to her mouth to hold back a scream. She couldn't be found hiding here or she'd end up dead, just like the priest. They would stage it as a robbery gone wrong, so this wouldn't create conflict with the temple. The leader suddenly darted to the edge of the building, but no one was there. He smiled a sinister smile. It seemed the little mouse had gotten away. Ileana ran as fast as she could. A second too late and that dangerous man would have caught her. What did she just witness? Did they really kill a priest? Who should she tell? But she couldn't. If they got wind of her speaking about this, they'd kill her to keep her quiet. She needed to calm down. She sat in the library. Since she'd heard about it, she'd looked for any information related to the Book of Prophecy, but her search proved to be futile. What little information she'd found in folklore all varied. The only bit of factual information found was that it was indeed a book with prophecies. She walked over with her bookmarked books ready to check them out of the library. Why was the Book of Prophecy never mentioned in the novel? But it seemed there was a few instances that weren't mentioned in the novel. Ileana's home environment and her bruises, and her diary. As she passed by 2 trainees, she overheard them talking about the murdered priest. She clutched the books tightly and rushed ahead. She prayed she didn't get caught up in all that had happened. She already had enough to deal with regarding Magnus. Back at the cabin, Magnus laid on the bed, writhing in agony. Why did she abandon him? Nightmares haunted his mind, and no matter how much he cried, she didn't come. The silence was deafening as loneliness ate away at his mind. Anger flashed in his eyes. She shouldn't have left him. He rushed off the bed in furious movements. He fell and voices bombarded his mind, all of them repeating one name. Magnus. He covered his ears to shut out the sound, but it was no use. Who was Magnus? He stopped as clarity hit him like a wave. Is that why she always called him Mag? He sat on his knees and said it clearly as if he'd always known. Magnus D. Cloud. Yes, that was him. He smiled wickedly. Your beast has finally become a human, he said. And I'm coming for you, my Lina.